Thank you so much to McKesson. So McKesson is one of our Blockchain Center of Excellence business partners. And so we're thrilled to have you. You're going to close out our 2020 blockchain conference. So again, thank you for being here. But the good news is we can relax because another session's not coming afterwards. So I hope we get to enjoy our last session. I'd like to introduce the three people we have from McKesson here. So we have Justin Bowers. He is currently Vice President of Contract Administration and Financial Services. Now, Justin's been with McKesson for 18 years, but guess what, folks? We had him first, okay, because he is an alum of the University of Arkansas and earned his degree in the Sam Walton College of Business in Finance. And Scott, it's so nice to see you again. So I've known Scott for about 2 years now. And at McKesson since about 2013, he's really been leading their effort for the ultimate compliance with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So that's been keeping you busy now for quite a bit of time. And the other thing, Scott, is you volunteer your time. You're helping the world with open standards. And I know you do a lot with GS1. So thank you for what you're doing there. And Mark Treshock, he is currently the Blockchain Solutions Leader for Healthcare and Life Sciences. Now, you've got a very interesting background, Mark. You've been in small companies, mid-sized companies, really large companies like IBM and HCL. And you've really been a slacker academically, I got to say. You've only have degrees from Cornell, Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Tisch School of Arts at NYU. So I want to thank you all for being here, and we can't wait to hear what you're going to share about pharma asset tracing. So I'm going to turn the stage over to you, and then when you're ready for Q&A, just call me back.
Okay, great. And Mary, just before you disappear, just to clarify, Mark is with IBM still. And we'll be presenting from that perspective. He has coordinated some activities with McKesson, and we welcome him as part of the group. But
so you're telling me the very last introduction of that's the one I flubbed was the last one?
I just wanted to make sure Mark
I'm glad you did, Scott. Keep me honest. Thank you so much.
I wanted to make sure he wasn't expecting us to send a check.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to activate the sharing functionality here, I hope. Let's kind of get this going up here, get it into this presentation mode. And hopefully now at this particular point in time, you can all see it. Is that correct? Great. Want to start out and begin by talking about McKesson's journey through blockchain. And we have this broken up into 3 sections. I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey and some of the paths that we've taken. Justin's going to take you through a very specific use case that we are investigating. And then Mark is going to kind of close out this session talking about some things from the IBM perspective and some use cases that they're looking at for blockchain in the healthcare sector as well. So I want to begin first by sharing with you that McKesson began our blockchain journey purely from a perspective initially that we had a pending regulation that had just been released by the federal government, and that pending regulation required us to do some things such as traceability for pharmaceutical products, serialization of those pharmaceutical products, verification and reporting along those products as well. The DSCSA was a brand new law that kicked off in 2014. It began doing traceability in 2015 and has a 10-year evolution. And as we looked at the existing solution sets out there, one of the things that we wanted to get into was understanding, did current technology help us meet those needs, or did we have some gaps in that? And for that reason, we wound up looking at blockchain initially through a DSCSA lens or through a regulatory lens to begin with. Our industry, the pharmaceutical industry, has been using automation and computer technology for a significant number of years. There is a lot of legacy ERP systems deployed across this industry, a lot of legacy WMS systems, warehouse management systems deployed. And I would suggest that the pharmaceutical industry was probably a pretty early adopter of EDI in many cases. There's extensive EDI framework between the manufacturers, the distributors, and the GPOs. So it's not something new to our industry, the concept of sharing data across different trading partners, but blockchain added that additional complexity of providing perhaps a different mechanism for some of those things to happen in. I would say one of the other things that has come up as we've done this investigation of blockchain and its use cases in our industry has been, if you were doing this in a greenfield state where you might be looking for a lift from going from 0 to 60, you have all that benefit to be able to reap. Because we're looking at this from an infrastructure that's heavily based on EDI before, the lift is a little bit different. It's more like going from 50 to 60 lift as opposed to 0 to 60 lift. And you'll hear some of that as we kind of go through some of the use cases that are coming up. For McKesson, the journey took us through working with a number of different trading partners and a number of different entities as we tried to understand blockchain and its possible applications for us. We joined several coalitions. We worked with standards groups. We worked with a number of different solution providers. We have worked with study groups or educational organizations, but we've joined primarily everything we could in the early days to really get some experience and some understanding as to what was going on, to be able to understand where there's practicality and where there's not. And it took quite a bit of time for us to go through that effort, but it was fairly important for us to kind of get out of our traditional mindset and look at this with a slightly different lens. In the DSCSA space, this is where we began our journey. There were 3 primary requirements coming up for the Drug Supply Chain Security Act to help make sure that the US supply chain is safe, that it's efficient, that we can truly track items at a very, very precise level. And one of the underlying things that it requires is that we pass what's called transaction information between sellers and buyers of the product. Now, typically, when you think about some of the industry things that have happened before, you might think about invoicing, you might think about having purchase orders being exchanged. But in the DSCSA, what they're looking to have us do is to exchange a drug pedigree, if you will, that identifies the product at a very granular level. It's not just to a batch level, but it's to an individual serial number on the actual product itself. Describe that product, its name, its content, its form, etc. Name the seller of that particular product and your address information to identify where it came from. Name the purchaser of that, almost as if you were preparing a title or a deed for that particular product. Very synonymous with like a vehicle title, serial numbers and all that kind of stuff being applicable. Another thing that the DSCSA requires as we go through the deployment and the development is being able to verify that serial number that's encoded in a product identifier on a product, being able to scan that and verify that it matches the manufacturer's assigned data for that particular item. So we needed to be able to look at a way to establish connectivity in the industry between the manufacturers and the distributors and the dispensers who may be touching that product to create an efficient mechanism so that we could scan the 2-dimensional barcode that's actually affixed to the bottle and be able to recognize that, transmit that somewhere, or look at it somewhere to be able to confirm that that's truly a legitimate bottle. And the third major task that the DSCSA requires of us is that as we develop these systems, that we be able to do something called facilitating the gathering of the previous events for a particular item. So if a manufacturer were to sell a product to McKesson and McKesson is a distributor, there would be a transaction information data set or title or pedigree, if you will, for the transaction from the manufacturer to the distributor. When the distributor sells that product to a dispenser, there is another transaction data set, pedigree or title, if you will, transferring the ownership of that item from the distributor to the dispenser, and so on. And if you have larger supply chains, you may have multiple steps going up that line. And one of the things the DSCSA has asked that we have to do is to be able to look at a product, gather the serialized information from that product, and then be able to gather all those previous events for that item to be able to accumulate them, whether it's for a regulatory investigation, whether it's because something is perceived to be wrong with the item and you want to authenticate its legitimacy. So these were the primary use cases that industry has to address in the pharmaceutical space, and were the initial candidates for looking at this from a blockchain perspective. Now, the next slide is the same 3 bullets that you see here with some comments in color coding, and here it is here. as we went through the use cases, we looked at each of the 3 use cases through a lens of, can we solve this perhaps with some of the existing tools in the industry that exist today? Who needs to see the data? Who needs to make use of the data? How much data is there? And is the data there because it's stipulated in the regulation that it must be there? Or is the data there because it has a practical application? And I'll talk a little bit more about that one here in just a second. But in each of the 3 use cases that we found and we looked at, we actually are moving ahead in the industry in 2 of the 3 using a blockchain solution. The first use case that we looked at under the DSCSA was the pure exchange of the DSCSA transaction information that was defined by the statute and is required to be sent between the seller and the purchaser of an RX product. Now, unfortunately, the regulation defines a lot of things that are in the requirements for this particular document or this particular data set, but are not necessarily practical from a machine-to-machine exchange of data. For example, each product is identified with a product ID number or an NDC number that uniquely registers that product with the FDA. That NDC number is defined unique for a particular compound, strength, form, description, etc. But in the regulation, we're required to share the name of the product, the form of the product, the strength of the product, a lot of that type of data, which is redundant to the digital encoding of the NDC number. So there's a lot of overhead carried in this particular message. Also, the message is only relevant to the 2 parties in this particular transaction. It is between the seller and the buyer. There are no 3rd parties or 4th parties or 5th parties who may need to share this particular data. And in the pharmaceutical industry, there is a fairly unusual alignment, if you will, of trading partners. There are roughly only about 600 manufacturers of pharmaceutical drugs in the United States. There are only 120 distributors of pharmaceutical products in the United States, but 3 of those 120 distributors account for 94% of the market. So it is not a broad distributor mechanism in the middle. It's fairly defined to some small number of entities. And then, of course, you have almost 100,000, I think it's like 78,000 dispensers, practitioners, and so on who may be purchasing it. But it's not a very broad model otherwise. The 2 use cases that are moving ahead looking at blockchain are the verification of product identifiers and assailable returns. This use case is a little bit different. It has 60,000 products that individually need to be mapped to repositories where the manufacturers may be storing their data. It has many, many requesters because it's not just that limited number of distributors who may be doing verifications. It's the 78,000 dispensers and practitioners. So we have a good number of manufacturers, a great number of products involved, a great number of requesters involved. And one of the things that we researched and understood as we went through this is that this is not a very static list. Manufacturers transfer ownership of products all the time between themselves. A molecule that may be being marketed today by Pfizer in a year may have been transitioned or sold off to Sandoz or some other company. And even though the product has remained the same, the party responsible for verification has changed. So you have a lot of movement where people need to stay aligned, and the flexibility is necessary for mapping that. For that purpose, our industry is moving ahead, looking at using blockchain for management of lookup directories to help assist in routing requests for verification between various different trading partners, because we have this many to many to many activity going on. The third use case that we're examining for blockchain inside the pharmaceutical industry right now is about facilitating the gathering. And as I mentioned up in the first part, there's a lot of regulatory overhead in that very first bullet that's red that we were not planning to use a blockchain for. But the industry seems to be aligning around the notion that even though we're going to be still exchanging that regulatory data in a point-to-point methodology, some portions of that data should be used to put clues, or I've heard them called a variety of different things. Some people call them trace histories. Some companies have called them zero knowledge proofs. They're called a variety of different things, but put clues that an event has occurred between 2 trading partners onto a blockchain with the serial number and the GTIN that's identified for that particular item, so that when it comes time to facilitate the gathering for that particular bottle, you can take the information from the barcode of that bottle, go to a blockchain, and on that blockchain, you can identify that this blockchain had 3 previous transactions which were registered for it. One transaction occurred between perhaps the manufacturer and this distributor. Another one was between this distributor and another distributor potentially. And the third transaction was between the final distributor and the dispenser. And that will allow you to facilitate the gathering of that information because you've identified all of the places it's been before. The advantage of this module or this model of being able to do it is you're using a slimmed down data set. You're not pushing things like text descriptions, which might be 50 characters long of the item into the blockchain, which is required in the first bullet on this slide as part of that transaction information, but is not actionable, if you will, by machines or by software as we're exchanging this data through the system. We also look at this as a way that we can use encryption, because one of the things that is somewhat of a risk is that traceability information, while it is designed to secure the US supply chain and make drugs safer, to make sure you can identify where they've been before, also exposes some risks that you are sharing potential trade secrets or trade information on volumes of activity between specific trading partners, dates of activity between specific trading partners. So needing to have this data encrypted or some way to be able to protect it is something that seems to be fairly important. So these are the 3 initial use cases that we've looked at for blockchain for DSCSA. Some of the considerations, as you've heard me explain this, we've gone through this for when we look at a use case as to whether it's a successful one or not to use a blockchain application for, is things around questions like who needs the data? Is it data that's only used by one party that's proprietary, or you share it with another party? Or is it data that has multiple parties that may need access to that particular information in order to be able to operate? How critical is the timing of that data or the understanding of that data? So for example, if everybody needs to be synchronized so at any given point in time they have a common understanding of the information, that's a model where blockchain is more effective than some of the methods we may be using today, where EDI tends to allow things to get out of whack a little bit. One of the other questions on here, and it kind of presents itself in a strange manner, is trust. You will often hear people describe a blockchain as an immutable source of truth, but trust is something else that will often come up. And trust is an interesting notion when you look at an industry that commercially interacts with other trading partners. You have to worry a little bit about confidential trade data, who can see what. You have to also worry a little bit about the value or the risk of putting data into a blockchain at times that might be able to be mined if you're not very careful. You may be able to, for example, encrypt identifiers as to trading partners. But if you're using the same encryption methodology consistently, and you're in a market, for example, like distributors are in the United States, at some point in time, you might be able to identify the big 3 distributors based on the volume of the transaction. So we had to do a lot of work and thought around that. And then finally, one of the questions that's still very much open in our industry at this particular point in time as we're looking at some of these considerations is the regulatory requirements and corresponding liability. Healthcare in the United States is a heavily regulated industry. There are severe penalties for non-conformance and non-compliance in sometimes the hundreds of millions of dollars for failure to maintain records in a proper manner or failure to maintain data and have it readily available to the FDA. So one of the questions we're still struggling a little bit as we look at some of these use cases is, if we're using a blockchain that is shared across the industry, whether it's operated by a consortium or by a solution provider, and somehow we manage to have an issue with the corruption of the data, or there's a failure point at some point, in addition to the distributor or the manufacturer who made that product or the trading partner who bought the product, who has the regulatory burden, does some of that regulatory burden or opportunity for penalties shift to the blockchain and to the coalition that may be underwriting? So very open question in that particular avenue. Use cases that we've looked at beyond DSCSA include master data sharing as a potential use case coming up here, perhaps using blockchains to enhance recall management, inventory management, and this one's somewhat tricky because it comes times to have discussions about who knows where the inventory is, who controls the inventory. And recently, as we saw in COVID-19, one of the questions that came up was who makes the determinations as to how to allocate inventory that's out in the supply chain. Visibility is one thing to grant. The control or the management of the access to the product is another thing to grant, and it could be fairly contentious between the various different players in the industry. Authorized trading partner identification and digital credentials is another case that we're starting to look at, perhaps the use of blockchain for that. Justin is going to follow me here in just a second and talk about some of the industry applications around financial and pay system applications, and particularly one that talks about synchronizing between the manufacturer, the distributor, the dispenser, and a GPO, perhaps relative to contracting and contract pricing. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. I would suggest to you at this point, the industry is relatively in its infant stage in as far as healthcare is concerned for using blockchain. We do have some hurdles to overcome, one of which is that desire at times to not have to invest if you don't need to invest. And when does come that point where you make a migration from some of those legacy systems to some other approach that might be more advantageous in the long run. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to Justin next.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. So first, before I kick off, go Hogs. Let's win our first SEC game tomorrow. We can't lose 20 straight. Well, I guess we lost 20 straight, 21. So let's mature past the win mark here. Scott, if you want to go in advance for me. I appreciate you guys being with us and helping understand the wholesale distributor aspects of healthcare is very much different. And some of you guys who may have attended last year, I talked around this, the mechanics of our financial operations and financial services, and which I'm part of. So Scott really talked about the movement and tracking of the inventory and really those drugs and what is really important to our end state patient. What I'm going to talk about is, if you think about the parallel path of the financial systems that go along with that, and particularly a unique fashion, which we call contracts and chargebacks, some in the food industry, and then of course in the medical or pharmaceutical distribution are familiar with this. And outside that, it's pretty much a niche market. And when you think about the players, I'm an administrator of the pricing and cost points that are negotiated between our manufacturer and our in-state customer. There are other players in the, that are called GPOs, or group purchasing organizations, which allocate, consolidate, and bring buying power to manufacturers to reduce the cost of that end prescriptions or device that will be provided to our end customers, or even a consumer in some cases. That mechanism is administrated through our internal systems. And again, Scott called out, there's really three major players, McKesson being the number one in the industry in this area. And I'm going to call back on some of the things that Scott talked about is around the unique customer identifiers. So when you think about a manufacturer produces a product and that pill bottle that Scott held up, and our customer says, I want that. So what we do is we pull together and we aggregate all the cost points from what the manufacturer says that customers are available for, what McKesson is actually purchasing the product for, what is the end customer going to pay for that product, which we abide by the manufacturer who set that pricing, and then communicate with the GPOs along the way. As you can imagine, this is a very simple diagram and process flow, which shows all of the connection points and the data flows from a manufacturer to a GPO, to a distributor, to an end customer, and who's dispensing that. And what you have is both the buy side economics of what is McKesson procuring the cost of inventory at with the sell side economics of what is a customer willing to pay for products and what have they agreed to. And then how do we reconcile? So we have looked at, and this is a process that is fairly mature. Today, it's automated through the pharmaceutical side through EDI transactions, 845s, 867s, 844s, pretty standard formats. Medical device side, not so much. It's actually still pretty manual. And where we were taking a step forward and partnering is saying, okay, think about this in the concept of is a contract that is validated across these parties. Again, trust is a word, and then data transmission. And how can we integrate that customer data? How can we have real-time validation, setting the expectation of what is really going to be paid for, automate the validation, think about 100% pricing accuracy. And as a consumer, we don't really think about that. We don't think about going to the Walmart and buying milk. And we say, yeah, that's great. I'm going to pay $2 for it. We get home and Walmart sends you a bill and says, you know, we should have charged you $2.25, so you owe us 25 cents. Or, hey, we overcharged you. It should have been $1.50. Here's 50 cents back. In the pharmaceutical distribution world, that's very common practice. And then the real-time validation of those contracts. So I, overseeing these transaction sets, know that when we place an order from the manufacturer, when we sell it to the end customer, that those cost points are going to be paid for by both. The manufacturer is going to reimburse McKesson for our invoice, and the customer is going to pay for the products and goods because the price is absolutely right. And that the financial view and flow coming back is called a chargeback. So we charge back the manufacturer for what we pass through and agreed to by our end customers. Again, on a chart, it looks pretty simple, but when you think about those ratios, 600 manufacturers, 150 to 180,000 dispensers, but when you take in the combination of every location, every variation between that, and then you put these identifiers, the HIN number, the DEA number, or a 340B number, which is used for PHS and other markets, you end up getting a combination of 3.5 million records that we have to coordinate, align, and then transfer to make this process work. You'll go to the next slide. So when you think about that, why would you invest? If the process is working, which McKesson has one of the leading industry pricing accuracies at 99.7% accurate, why would you invest in basically 3 basis points? Well, there's a lot of costs to coordinate and run this process. Having real-time, accurate, timely resolution allows issue resolutions and for me to answer customers even more confidently. The customer's experience, reducing those discrepancies or pricing corrections over or under overall, so they know when they pay for their invoices from their distributor, they are guaranteed that it's 100% correct. Scott talked about the compliance. We are constantly under scrutiny of looking to see where is the drug pricing, how do you play in it? And as a distributor, we are the middle person between it, and we're not setting that market pricing, yet as an aggregator, it's a lot easier to come to 3 major players in the market than it is the 600 or 180,000 to make sure that it was correct. So again, advancing the process maturity and the accountability of that information is a good driver in ROI for McKesson. And then lastly, I process around $60 billion in transactions on an annual basis through this process. And that process has time, it has cash flow, and for cash flow, there's opportunity. So i.e., if I'm able to collect faster from my manufacturer or for our customers because we can guarantee it's 100% accurate, there's benefits to McKesson's internal cash flow. And honestly, it flows out to our customers as well as our manufacturers. Again, having 100% accountability and accuracy makes the process move much quicker, and you're able to pull costs out of the system as well as ensure compliance within it. Last slide, Scott. So really just want to kind of tell you where we're at. We've been really a pilot in this industry. Thinking blockchain and taking it to the financial services, from commercial aspects and banking industry is not a big deal. From taking something that has been a very complex and core piece of the business, it really hasn't been shaken up in almost a decade or more. And so what we've looked at is using proof of concepts to say, can we validate between our trading partners and a few GPOs and even our competitors to go into it together? Can we make sure that we can trade this information back and forth with the current landscape in our ERPs and our systems and platforms? And will that work? So that's really phase 1, is we've been doing a production release, just validating the data. So saying, do we have alignment? Would you take that into your system? And the one hinge pin to blockchain for our industry is that adoption and trust. If it's only McKesson and a couple of big manufacturers, it's a really expensive solution, and it doesn't get a lot of ground to make sure that you want to have that full investment. If you're able to bring the industry along with you, and it's the 80-20 rule, then it makes sense, and then you can actually gain ground. What we're hoping to do in the phase 2 is really start transacting financials. Up to this point, it's been a proof of concept of data transmission, alignment, and would it fit into our systems, and could we utilize the data? In phase 2, we're going to start transacting the financial dollars and see how we can actually move and show these benefits that were on slide 2 to generate into our in-state business. So thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark to tell us how it all works technically.
Thanks, Justin. As Scott mentioned, I'm with IBM, and I'm IBM's global solution leader for blockchain and healthcare and life sciences. And I'm fortunate enough to be a guest in the McKesson session. So thank you, Justin and Scott, for allowing me to join you here. I'm going to double click on the idea of trust that Scott first mentioned and that Justin reiterated, and talk a little bit about how that concept of trust comes through in blockchain in 2 different use cases in healthcare and life sciences. So we're going to double click on the notion of trust and then see how it's applied in healthcare and life sciences in some different ways. You go to the next slide, please. So the aspect of blockchain that we're going to focus on here in these use cases specifically is the notion of immutability, right? That's really what gives us the foundation that we can build on from there to establish trust, but then also, of course, the idea of privacy and confidentiality. Blockchain gives us the unique ability to have privacy and transparency at the same time. And that's something that's very critical, when we talk about applications in general, but in particular to healthcare and life sciences. Let's just advance this. I forgot how to build up in it. Let's go to the next slide. And as we like to say, when we think about blockchain, it's a great way to keep track of stuff. And that's a good litmus test that we at IBM use for any blockchain use case. So the first use case I want to talk about, and this is live and in production, it's called IBM Rapid Supplier Connect. And this is something that we launched in 3 weeks in response to the COVID pandemic. And the situation that we were seeing, I'm sure many of you saw this too, is that healthcare institutions, so care facilities, couldn't get the medical supplies that they needed through the traditional supply lines because those manufacturers were tapped out, others were ceasing operation. It became a very chaotic situation. But simultaneously, and this is a great testament to the entrepreneurial spirit, we had manufacturers in other industries pivoting in to help, to respond. So you had apparel companies in Brazil making PPE and gowns. You had skateboard companies in California, in LA, making face shields. You had beer breweries making hand sanitizer. Thankfully, they've gone back to making beer, but that's a different conversation. And then, of course, you have the well-publicized examples of Ford and General Motors and Dyson Vacuum Cleaner Company making ventilators. And that's incredible. That's an incredible testament to our ability. But it became very interesting because we were having a conversation, the one that started this all off, with a procurement director in a hospital in New Hampshire. And this person was describing this chaotic situation. And we said, well, what about this company down here and that company over there and that company over there? And this person was like, I don't run in the same circles they do. So I have no way to meet an apparel company in Brazil who's now making face masks. And when they email me, I have no idea who they are because they're not in my space. So how do I trust them, and how do I figure out if I should do business with them? And the sad fact is that, we also saw a tremendous surge in nefarious and criminal activity and fraud around this. So that's where this idea came together. And what Rapid Supplier Connect is, it's a single source of truth. So now we're into the blockchain notion here. It's a single source of truth for supplier identity information, I'll get into that in a second, combined with a marketplace where buyers, which in this case are care facilities, can connect with these non-traditional suppliers of PPE and emergency medical equipment. So it's a place where these parties can meet, and it's a place where buyers can get a sense of the authenticity of suppliers. So let's go to the next slide. So how does that work, right? So the idea here is that if you're a supplier and you want to do business with a new company, a new trading partner, there is typically a very long process, right, where that trading partner checks you out. You have to supply financial information, ownership information, attestations of compliance, certifications. It could be a very lengthy list, and it could take weeks, if not months, to do that. And the COVID emergency, necessitated that we squeeze that down to be as quick as we can. So what we did was we created a portal, a place where suppliers could come and create a digital identity for themselves. And in this portal or profile, actually passport's a better word, they would upload this critical information about themselves. So again, this is financial information, ownership information, a wide variety of things. And this would be recorded immutably on the blockchain, right? And that's key, because then when a buyer or a prospective buyer came to look at this, they would have absolute assurance that what they're looking at is what that supplier intended to upload, right? What they intended to see. But then we didn't stop there, because that only gets you half the way. Then once that information is immutably recorded, we then in the background took steps to validate the pieces of it that can easily be validated. So for example, suppliers have a Dun & Bradstreet number, a DUNS number. If I'm a supplier and I say my DUNS number is 12345, that's recorded immutably on the blockchain. In the background, the system could go pull from commercial sources, which were a part of this with us, from Dun & Bradstreet, and check, is that indeed this company's Dun & Bradstreet number? And then pull that information into the profile too. So now you have a situation where you could trust what the supplier is seeing. Big pieces of that are being validated and verified by external sources, and that is itself being recorded immutably onto the blockchain. So this is really the idea where you create one college application and then send it everywhere, right? Going back to the comment that I'm somewhat overeducated, which I agree with there. And the goal of this, again, is very simple and very straightforward. It was to squeeze down the time that it took for a buyer to decide if they want to transact with a supplier. Again, from weeks or months down to days and hours. So the transaction itself did not take place on this platform. We decided very purposely that speed was essential. And buyers and suppliers have procure-to-pay platforms. If both are on Ariba or Coupa or any of the others, they could transact there, right? After they meet and confirm the relationship through this. Or in some cases, we saw them transacting completely offline, over the phone and fax. And again, we built Rapid Supplier Connect on top of Trust Your Supplier, which is a blockchain-based solution for supplier identity that's in production today. We took a copy of that, made some changes that made it kind of very tightly focused on COVID and these categories of emergency medical supplies, and then pushed it out into the market in 3 weeks. And we got this up in, I think it was late March or early April, and it ran until the end of August, when it was merged back into Trust Your Supplier. So that's an example of trust for companies. Now I'm going to skip ahead. Let's go ahead to the next one. It's in the interest of time. So I'm going to go from companies, the example of trust for companies, now down to trust for the generations of tomorrow. So we don't normally think about, well, at least I hadn't normally thought about, in vitro fertilization. So the practice of taking biological samples, so sperm and egg and fertilized embryos, right? And taking that through an in vitro fertilization process. In reality, this practice, I'll use the term industry, already is responsible for tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of births. And the technology now and the need for that in the world, in the US and elsewhere, means that it can scale now to hundreds of millions of births in the years to come. So the technology to take these samples, again, egg, sperm, and embryo, and vitrify them or preserve them, has advanced to the point where these samples can be held for decades. Essentially, they could be held more or less indefinitely. So this creates a problem, or a challenge rather. How do you identify the sample? How do you maintain information about it over years or decades? How do you trust that the sample, the material that you're going to take, accept into your body, accept into your family, is what you think it is what you think it is? And this is an industry that currently, relies on lots of practitioner-focused practices. So this group, IVF Open, has formed to help bring standardization to this practice, to this medical practice, so that the industry could grow. So a big part of that now is trust. And here I'll focus on two pieces. First is that this industry will adopt a universally unique ID. So very much as Scott described, the identifiers on pharmaceuticals, soon there will be a similar structure on these biological samples that will make sure that each one is universally unique throughout the world, throughout time, right? So you will be able to number or identify a sample uniquely. Then similarly, as Scott described, there will be information about that sample that we need to exchange, I'll just use Scott's analogy, between these trading partners. So between labs or facilities that collect the samples to where they're stored potentially for years or decades, then to the clinics where they are, brought to use and planted into a woman potentially somewhere else in the world from where the samples were collected to be brought to life. There's information that we need to keep track of in time memorial. And this is where blockchain comes in, because we record this information immutably on the blockchain. We're able to associate that information back to that sample through this unique ID and through other kind of security measures that we could talk about if there's interest, and therefore ensure that this very important and very sensitive process in people's lives, that there is complete trust, transparency, but also privacy in it as well. And I know we're near the end, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to conclude my remarks there. But again, thank you to Scott and Justin for allowing me into your session today.
Well, Mark, we're thrilled to have IBM here. You are also a member of the Blockchain Center of Excellence and one of our founding first 5 partners. So we're thrilled to have you with us. Fantastic conversation, gentlemen. So I'm monitoring multiple things. And so what I thought I would do at the end here is I'll just kind of combine a couple questions and target it to each person. And Mark, I'm going to start with you because you've got many clients, many customers. So one person asked, how many solutions are we going to end up with to comply with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act? Can we really get down to one? Or is a company like McKesson going to have to attach to a bunch of different networks because the pharmaceutical manufacturers picked this solution? So what do you see there?
I think it's actually interesting. So Scott and I are part of a group called the Partnership for DSCSA, Governance, where this question is being resolved. So what the direction the industry seems to be going in, of course, Scott would like your view on this as well, is that there will be multiple solutions, some set of them, maybe a handful or 2 handfuls, and those solutions need to talk to each other in a way that is very explicitly defined. So those solutions need to be interoperable with each other so that if McKesson joins one and a group of pharma manufacturers join another and a group of dispensers or pharmacies join a third, ultimately that shouldn't matter in terms of being able to comply with the regulation because those solutions will interoperate. And those individual solutions, they could be based on blockchain or any number of technologies. they don't all need to be blockchain based, as long as they could talk to each other.
So Scott and Justin, do you want to weigh in here? How many blockchains or non-blockchain solutions are you willing to join to be compliant with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act?
Well, I think in the DSCSA, as Mark mentioned, the issue relates to a couple of different factors. One of which is that the government does not have a mandate and actually is explicitly barred from picking a single solution. The model that Congress gave them was an open market model that wanted to let industry pick the solution. So we have some challenges that we have there. It'd be really easy if somebody came in and said, everybody do this. So the Pharmaceutical Data Governance Group, or the Partnership for DSCSA Governance that Mark mentioned, is walking through these issues. I suspect what will likely happen is that there conceptually will be about 30 different potential solutions out there. And they may not all necessarily be a blockchain. Some of them may be, but if you look at the number of solution providers that play in this space, if you look at the size of some of the entities that may choose to do data management on their own, I think that universe is relatively defined. And even if I'm off by 100%, 30 to 60 is not a greatly different number. But the interoperability is key. That is one of the issues early on that got a lot of attention, because a lot of times when you started talking to people wanting to offer blockchain solutions, you got into it had to be this format or that format. They could not talk to each other. When you get into talking about smart contracts, this does it differently than that does it. So the question is, how do you put something in the middle? So regardless of what your underlying technology may be based on, you have that ability to interact with each other. That I think is going to be where we have to really figure that one out.
Okay, great.
And that's where I think standards fits, quite honestly.
Oh, well, you're going to get my next question,
Okay.
Scott, because a question came in. We've had G10, we've had all these standards for so long. So why do we need to evolve standards like GS1? Is it because of blockchain technology? Is it because of the context of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act?
So we're going through an evolution, and we have had standards for a long time, but the utilization or the adoption of standards is pivoting, and it's pivoting in medical devices, it's pivoting in pharmaceuticals, and we saw a pivot begin this week in food. But traditionally, from a commerce perspective, and I don't know if this is going to show up well, but from a commerce perspective, we have had UPCA barcodes on products in the US for cash register purposes since early 80s, late 70s. I forget exactly what date it was the first pack of Wrigley gum got scanned. But that identifies what this is. And that's all it really does. It just says this is a atorvastatin calcium 40 milligram. It doesn't tell me anything about this beyond what it is. And the evolution that's going on right now is the switch from just having a G10 encoded in a product to now having other data elements encoded in a machine readable form. Lot numbers have existed forever, but they were always printed in human readable format. And the DSCSA requires that lot numbers be encoded now in the barcode. Serial number is a new attribute that's being required to be encoded in the barcodes on drug products to make sure that this bottle is uniquely identifiable from its twin that was made in the same production run. And then expiry is now machine readable as well, because that's required to be encoded. So part of the evolution is in pharmaceuticals now we have the 2D data matrix barcode that has all those elements in there, and things that we can do in industry and in dispensing are different. When I scan to identify this item, if I'm a pharmacist, I can now also look at that lot number and check a database to see if it's ever been on a recall. I can have the software take a look at the expiration date and make sure if I'm filling a 90-day prescription for a patient, that the date of the product will carry them past the end of that 90 days, as an example. And these were things before that somebody had to eyeball on the product. But even more importantly, those data elements, if they can be captured for that purpose, can also be captured in the commerce side. So that as we're selling products between the supply chain, the manufacturer, when they sell us this bottle, can tell us what lot number it was. When it expired, can tell us the serial numbers. We can tell the dispensers, you bought lot number such and such. So we get out of a lot of the guessing games that we've had in the past. And that's the cusp that pharmaceuticals are going through. medical devices just recently went through that because they're using almost the same nomenclature. And earlier this week or late last week, I forget exactly what day, it might have been Thursday of last week, the FDA announced that they're going to now start tracking certain food products similar to the way that we are tracking pharmaceuticals, trying to track pharmaceuticals. I'm not quite sure what the risk is, but they're starting with peanut butter. Go figure.
Oh, a lot of peanut allergies. That's
Peanut,
why.
well, and I think there may be some salmonella issues going on or something, but they are moving towards certain food categories and nut-containing products, whether they be bars or peanut butters or things like that. Nut-containing products are going to be evolved into a traceability model through the supply chain.
Okay, I'm going to toss a question to Justin. So I'm going to, one of our students asked a question. So Ava, I'm going to actually generalize the question that you asked. So Justin, we have some questions on smart contracts. And are they really, are your contracts really deterministic enough that you can encode them with programming logic? Do you have things like in goodwill or in good faith clauses, or what are the limitations of automating contracts?
Yeah, great question. And for clarification, a lot of people hear contracts and they think legal binding agreements. And really, this is the administration of cost points. And so it's a contractual agreement of pricing points. And there is some complexities into it, but it's from a manufacturer and through a in-state customer. And what we are doing in the smart contracts is saying that you can break those and decipher those contracts and agreements and price points and quantity and compliance down into data attributes that can be systematically tracked and put onto a shared network that then can be automatically validated. And so when you think about from the original language agreement to the data for, digitalization of that agreement, let me put it that way, into our systems. And we do that today, but the difference is we all have our own source of truth. So a manufacturer A to a customer B to a group purchasing organization to a distributor all take what they think the manufacturing customer said. We put it into our own system of record. That becomes a source of truth, and then we transact off of that. And so what you're doing is you're taking that digital contract and putting it up into a shared network, which can be automated. Again, the one aspect, and we all talked about it, is trust, is the way that McKesson versus our competitors consumed that contract. Are we all really willing to share it out? And there are discrepancies. Like I mentioned, we are the leading pricing accuracy distributor, which means that we have a different version than some of my competitors. And why? You'd have to, go into their systems to find out. But great question. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to end this 2-day conference. I'm going to ask you each for a soundbite. So we had 500 registrants, about 400 were business professionals, but 80 of them are our students. So we have 80 students, undergraduate and graduate. Do you have any advice for our students? Do you have any, it could be life advice, it doesn't have to be blockchain related. And I'll let anyone who wants to go first because somebody might want to think about it. So close us out of the conference with some advice for our students.
So I'll jump out first, being the Arkansas student grad, and then I'll let these guys who are more educated and tenured close you out. What I would say is, technology like blockchain or any technology that's advancing will continue to evolve, but technology without a business insight and innovation and leadership is flawed. And so you have good ideas coming out. Stay humble and hungry, and that will allow you to use the best of the next technology in the business application of it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Justin.
I'm going to follow up on that because I want to add to that. Your students at their perspective right now are learning about technology and learning about how that's going to move forward. And they probably are thinking about their career path very much in line with what their educational path may look like. But as you get into the real world, you start to learn to be able to apply those learnings to other applications. I was educated originally as an accountant. And while it's not IT type technology, it was interpreted by me as I went through the process like learning a language. I was learning the language of the business so that when I got out at McKesson, I started maybe in that area of our business, but it allowed me to know what was happening in the operations and the business and migrate into management and leadership and rely on those skills into the future. Your students are going to be coming out with the same kind of opportunity. They're going to understand the underlying technology and the systems. The challenge will be for them when they get out there, how do they take that into the rest of the business to be managing and leading the business as they get more engaged?
Very good. Thank you, Scott. All right, Mark, you
I'll
get
try
to be
to-
the last person for the conference to speak.
It's an incredible honor. Thank you. So I'll try to build on that and just echo the fact that, you know, technologies come and go. And what my advice to students would be, you know, in your time in school, focus on learning how to learn. Because when I started my career out of college, the internet was a new thing, right? Which is incredible. And I probably shouldn't have said that. But you know, just thinking about how far we've come since then. So learn how to learn. And then two, it's become comfortable with being uncomfortable, because the only constant is change and disruption. And you know, as we see now in the world you're coming into, the only constant is disruption. So, you know, find a way to operate in the world, you know, where you are comfortable being uncomfortable.
I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. I hope we get to see each other face to face in 2021. But thank you for all of us here at the University of Arkansas. And with that, folks, it's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.